you've created something called the Foundation of Five. Walk me through the framework of what that looks like and why you came about it. I imagine there's a story inside of that, and I think that will be extremely interesting to our listeners.
Yeah, it came about, oh man, probably about 20 years ago. I was getting some recognition from Morehouse College, and as part of that, they wanted me to speak to some students. And one student said, "Hey, if you could go back to your college age self, your 18-year-old self, what would you tell yourself?" And I came up with these kind of five F's. And the first one is focus. Well, I'm sorry, the first one is faith, and that on this journey, you're going to have faith in yourself. For me, faith in Jesus is my Lord and Savior, but you will be tried and tested, and your faith will be tested, and you won't make it without it. That's the first one. Second, and this is college kids now, focus. I said, hey, when I was in college, I went to parties, what have you, but I always was focused on what was most important, and I knew when to leave the party. So focus is important. I talked about fearlessness. Fearlessness is, hey, not the absence of fear, but the ability to walk anyway, because you have that faith I talked about earlier that's at your back, knowing the goodness and mercy will follow you. I talk about fortitude. It's not about how many times you get knocked down, it's how many times do you get back up, because you will get knocked down on this journey. And then last but not least, and they really appreciated this one, is I called it fellowship. And it's the birds of the feather flock together, the iron sharpens iron. And I would say things like, show me 9 of your friends, and I'll show you, who you are. If you have 5 broke friends, you're going to be the 6th one. So, those are kind of things I share with them.
Well, I love that. And I think it's always fun to talk to the generation that's beginning because I always see the promise and excitement of that generation. I told my son the other day, I said, we're a member of a country club, and we were talking about having these other places you can use the membership from. We don't barely use the one here, but I was like, they have these places you can go, and they're dinner clubs. And I said, there's one by your college, and I think it'd be pretty cool if you go in there. And his buddies were like, yeah, but what if we go in there and like nobody talks to us? And I said, you're going to find two types of people in that room. You're going to find people that are interesting and interested. And those that are interesting are going to provide you some level of opportunity to learn from, and they might only care about themselves and not care about you at all. And that's fine. But those that are interested are going to want to know, they want your energy. You have something they don't have. That's
Exactly.
extremely valuable. So just surrounding yourself with fellowship of people that are above you in life, just in age and wisdom, is such a valuable lesson.
Yeah, and the reciprocal is true too. At this age, I'll be 67 on my birthday. I like talking to younger people because they open my eyes. I mean, they were created in what I call the tech generation, and so they when it comes to social media and technology, I mean, I'm a sponge from them.
Yeah, I think that is extremely valuable, and I have a younger brother who has two kids under 3, and my wife and I invite him and his family over every weekend, and it's funny because you know uh, we have something that is valuable to them, and that is we have a little discretionary income that we can leverage and utilize to feed everybody and celebrate, and they're grinding through day in and day out, getting started. And it's a different vibe, right? And so, but they're bringing me energy. Those kids walk into that house and it provides my wife and I with so much energy and so much love. And the littlest, dumbest things we find to be amazing. Now you're a grandfather, so you get it. But I'm just an uncle, and I'm loving it because my boys are moving on in the next stage of life. And so, at 17 and 20, they're still giving me energy, but it isn't the same energy that you get from that 3-year-old who's just smiling at you because she loves that you're talking to her about a princess.
Yeah, and the great thing about being a grandpa is that after a while, you can give them back.
Right. Well, that's good. That's good with the uncle side too. I don't mind that, and I think there is some value. I think there's also the part where you're uh, you're concerned about their future in that you want to see them grow and become what they're meant to be, what God put them on this earth to become. But you're also not as scared and worried as we were as parents. There's something to be said when you're a parent. You're going through and you lay these faith, focus, fearlessness, fortitude, and fellowship. You lay that out, and if you're telling your children that, they're like, okay, dad, that's a great framework. They might take a couple of those things. And you're like, man, if you just listen to these things, you're going to be great. But with the grandkids, you have a little less worry and a little more understanding. Like, it's going to be okay.
Yeah, yeah. Scott, I have a confession to make though. As I got to the end of my career when I retired, a friend of mine said, "Hey, you've worked so hard, and why don't you take your kids on a trip?" And so I said, "That's great. I'll take all four of them." He said, "No, no, no." He says, "Their whole life, you treated all of them as if they were one kid. They were always four. Take them individually." And it was very humbling because I took each one individually to various trips they wanted to go on, but every one of them had a story about something I missed in their life, in their childhood, that meant the world to them that I ignored because I went to a business meeting or a business trip. It was my daughter's father-daughter dance her junior year. My son's walking out on senior night on the basketball court, and I'm not there. My other son, getting an award. And so it really kind of hit home. And it was a tearful moment for me for a second. And I said, guys, but, I was working, I provided all this stuff. You had the new Jordans. They said, Dad, we appreciated the stuff. We wish we'd had more of you. And it's a lesson I also share to younger, working execs and people. Hey, take that time because you don't get to make it up.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think looking back, it's definitely a challenge because you think that what your number one job is to provide and protect. And that's what we were brought up. All of us were brought up to believe that. And it is our number one job. And we do need to do that. But a lot of us take the provision of providing as something that maybe it becomes our own identity. Maybe it can become our own impact. And in doing so, we lose sight of some of the things that are more important. And you may or may not have been able to be at that junior dad dance. You may not have been able to be at senior night. There are times where you can make a change in your responsibility, and there are times where you can't. But I think sometimes it is something I look back on a lot, and I definitely was completely imperfect. And I look forward to learning about those moments and sharing them with my kids because it's good to at least that they shared it with you. I'm sure it was humbling. Where did you go? Did they pick the places, and which one did you find to be the most fun?
Yeah,
Like, what
it's
was
interesting.
most like
My
you?
oldest daughter wanted to go to a film festival in Miami. We did that. My oldest son wanted to go to NASCAR. He's into cars. My youngest son went to a men's fellowship retreat. And then my youngest daughter, she's my mini me. She said, "Dad, let's go do Vegas." So we went and did Vegas. But the other thing that I had to be honest about that is that the reason I was working so hard, Scott, was because of my own inferiority complex. I came out of inner city Cleveland. I went to public schools, public colleges, universities, and I'm working in environments with people from Harvard, Yale, and Wharton. And so my superpower is I was going to outwork them all, right? And so to your point and to your question, no, I probably didn't have to go to every presentation. I probably could have gone to that father-daughter dance, but was afraid that if I wasn't there, what signal is that sending? And later in my career, it kind of came to a head where I had to really focus on self-care and doing what was right for me.
Yeah, I think a lot of people struggle with that. And I don't know if it's always, feeling less than or trying to prove something. Sometimes it's just you get into a life that you've built and you don't even realize that going through the motions of the life you built wasn't the life that you actually wanted. So the reality is if you asked me what I wanted to be when I was 10 years old, 15 years old, 20 years old, I wanted to be a father. I wanted to be a husband. That's really what I wanted to be. And I didn't know what I want to be. You know how many people that I still say to this day, I have no idea what I want to be when I grow up. But I knew I wanted to be those two things. Yet those two things very many times took a back seat in my career and my life. And, that's disappointing when you look back, but it's also the course correction that you make along the way. And that's why I created the life model. You have your five part framework. And that probably was not only to teach young people, but it also allowed you to remember what was most important as well along the way. And my life model was my realignment. When I was too heavy into impact, I was not given time to the who's that I loved the most. And so I had to readjust. And so I would go through this exercise when I started to feel that emptiness, that feeling of aloneness. And It happens a lot when you're traveling a lot for work and you're sitting in a room and you're missing the moments that you should be home for. So YouTube has this cool feature where they pick the next video for you, and it's right here on this screen. So I hope you enjoy this next video.